Have you ever wondered how a single lie can destroy an entire life in just one night? Imagine being 15 years old, standing in the middle of a violent storm, rain pouring down, thunder shaking the sky, and the only place you ever called home suddenly closing its door behind you, not because of the truth, but because of a lie someone else chose to tell. Tonight's story begins on a night like that, a night when trust was broken in seconds, when anger replaced understanding, and when a young life was pushed into darkness with nowhere to go. In that moment, it felt like the end of everything. When the people who are supposed to protect you stop believing in you, the world suddenly becomes a very cold and lonely place. But sometimes, the darkest storms reveal the strongest hearts. Sometimes the moment meant to destroy you becomes the moment that builds the person you were always meant to become. And sometimes when everyone else turns away, an unexpected hand reaches out and changes the course of your entire life. This is not just a story about betrayal. It is a story about survival. It is about the quiet power of resilience, about rising from the lowest moment imaginable, and about proving without shouting, without revenge, without bitterness, that the truth can outlast any lie. Years after that stormy night, the past finally catches up with the present. The truth surfaces, regret arrives, and the people who once believed the lie come face to face with the life that was built after they turned their backs. In that moment, everything changes. The silence becomes louder than any argument ever could, and the realization hits harder than the storm that started it all. But the most powerful part of this story is the betrayal, and it is even the revenge. The real power lies in what happened afterward, how pain turned into strength, how abandonment turned into determination, and how one small act of kindness changed the direction of an entire life. So stay with this story until the very end, because what begins with a storm, a lie, and a broken heart will lead to a moment so powerful that it will make everyone in the room realize just how dangerous lies can be, and just how unstoppable a determined spirit can become. The day began like any other, quiet and ordinary, the kind of day no one remembers because nothing seems important enough to stand out. The sky was clear that morning, though the air carried a strange heaviness that hinted something was about to change. At 15, life still felt simple in many ways. School, homework, family dinners, and the small routines that made every day predictable. There was a belief that no matter what happened outside the house, home would always be the one place where things made sense. That belief had never been questioned before. The house itself felt normal that afternoon. Familiar sounds filled the rooms, the faint hum of the refrigerator, footsteps across the hallway floor, and the distant rumble of clouds slowly gathering beyond the windows. No one paid attention to the weather at first. Storms were common, especially during certain seasons, and they usually passed without much trouble. Inside the house, life continued the way it always had. But something subtle had changed. Conversations felt shorter than usual, and there was a tension in the air that could easily be explained. It was the kind of tension that sits quietly in the background, almost invisible, until suddenly it becomes impossible to ignore. The storm outside slowly grew stronger, dark clouds rolling in like a warning one had noticed in time. At 15, the world still seemed built on trust. Parents were supposed to protect, guide, and understand. Even during disagreements, there was always the assumption that things would be resolved, that misunderstandings would be cleared away like clouds after rain. No one expects the ground beneath them to disappear in a single moment. As the evening approached, the wind began to rise, rattling the windows and bending the trees outside. The sky turned darker earlier than usual, the kind of darkness that arrives long before night actually falls. Thunder echoed in the distance, low and heavy, like a slow drumbeat announcing something inevitable. Inside the house, emotions began to shift in ways that were harder to ignore. Words were spoken with sharper edges, glances carried suspicion instead of warmth, and the feeling of comfort that had always existed within those walls began to fade. What had started as an ordinary day was quietly transforming into something far more serious. At first, it still seemed impossible that anything truly bad could happen. Families argue sometimes. People get angry. Voices rise and fall. But deep down, there was still the belief that things would calm down, that the storm outside would pass, and life would return to normal. What no one realized in that moment was that the storm building inside the house would become far more powerful than the one raging in the sky. It started with a lie, so simple that no one thought to question it. Lies often begin that way. small enough to sound believable but sharp enough to cause damage the moment they are spoken. At first, the words seemed confusing, almost unreal, as if they had been pulled out of thin air for no reason at all. A sudden accusation filled the room, spoken with urgency and emotion, carrying just enough detail to sound convincing. The atmosphere in the house shifted instantly, like the calm air before lightning strikes. The accusation came unexpectedly, delivered with trembling words and dramatic emotion that made it feel urgent and serious. Tears appeared quickly, and the story unfolded in a way that painted a very clear picture of guilt. Every sentence added another layer to the lie, turning something imaginary into something that felt frighteningly real. It was the kind of performance that demanded attention, the kind that makes people react before they take the time to think. At 15, standing there and hearing those words felt like watching reality twist into something unrecognizable. The claim itself was shocking enough, but the speed at which it was believed made it even worse. There was no hesitation in the room, no pause for questions, no moment where anyone stopped to ask whether the story actually made sense. The lie had landed perfectly, and its impact spread through the room like a sudden burst of thunder. Attempts to explain the truth barely had time to form before they were drowned out by anger and disbelief. Every effort to defend against the accusation seemed to make things worse. The more the truth was spoken, the more it sounded like an excuse in the ears of people who had already decided what they believed. In that moment, the truth had no power because the lie had already shaped the story everyone was hearing. What made the lie even more painful was the familiarity of the voice telling it. Lies from strangers can hurt, but lies from someone within the same family cut much deeper. There was a sense of betrayal that grew heavier with every passing second. Each new detail added to the story made the situation feel more impossible to escape, as if an invisible trap had been set, long before anyone realized it existed. The storm outside grew louder as the lie continued to spread through the room. Thunder cracked in the distance while rain began tapping against the windows, almost like the world itself reacting to what was happening inside the house. In that moment, the truth stood alone, quiet and unheard, while the lie grew stronger with every tear and every word that followed. The moment the accusation was spoken, the reaction was immediate. There was no pause to ask questions, no moment of quiet thought to understand what had really happened. The words hung in the air for only a second before they were accepted as truth. At 15, standing in the middle of that room felt like watching a door slam shut without ever being given the chance to step through it. The people who were supposed to protect and listen had already made up their minds. Faces that once carried warmth now showed anger and disappointment. The shift was sudden and almost impossible to process. Voices grew louder, filled with frustration and judgment. Every glance felt sharp, like silent confirmation that the decision had already been made. It wasn't just that the lie was believed, it was believed completely, without even the smallest doubt. Attempts to speak were quickly interrupted. Every sentence meant to explain the truth seemed to vanish before it could even be finished. The more the truth was spoken, the more it sounded like denial to people who had already accepted a different version of events. It felt like being trapped in a room where no one could hear, even though the words were being spoken clearly. What made the moment even more painful was the absence of trust. Family is supposed to be the place where trust exists, even when the world outside becomes difficult. But in that moment, that trust disappeared as if it had never been there at all. Instead of asking questions or trying to understand, anger took control. The belief in the accusation was so strong that the truth didn't seem to matter anymore. The storm outside continued to build, wind pushing hard against the windows while rain began to fall harder against the glass. Inside the house, the emotional storm was even stronger. The atmosphere became heavy with judgment and frustration, every word spoken with a tone that made it clear the verdict had already been delivered. Standing there, it became painfully obvious that the story everyone believed had already been written. No explanation seemed powerful enough to change their minds. The feeling of being unheard grew heavier with every passing moment. At 15, it was the first time realizing that sometimes people don't look for the truth, they look for the version of events that feels easiest to accept. In that room, surrounded by the people who should have known better, the truth stood completely alone, while the lie continued to grow stronger, fueled by anger, disappointment, and the painful silence of trust that had vanished without warning. At 15, life is still balanced between childhood and the early steps of adulthood. It is an age where emotions are strong, but understanding of the world is still forming. There is still a deep belief that family is the one place where safety exists without conditions. When the outside world feels confusing or harsh, home is supposed to remain steady, a place where mistakes can be explained and truth can be heard. That belief makes betrayal from family feel heavier than almost anything else. The accusation had already shaken that sense of safety, but the deeper wound came from realizing that the people who were supposed to know the truth about character and intentions were the first to turn away. At 15, identity is still developing, and much of that identity is shaped by how parents see their child. When that reflection suddenly changes from trust to suspicion, it creates a confusion that is difficult to describe. Standing there while anger and disappointment filled the room felt like the ground had shifted beneath everything familiar. The voices that once offered comfort now sounded cold and distant. The expressions that once showed pride or concern were replaced by judgment. Every second made it clearer that the image they now believed was completely different from the person who had lived in that house for years. The pain wasn't just about the accusation itself. It was about the speed at which belief disappeared. At 15, there is still an expectation that parents will listen before deciding what is true. Even during serious disagreements, there is usually a moment where explanation is allowed. In this moment, that opportunity never came. The assumption of guilt arrived instantly, leaving no space for the truth to exist. The emotional weight of that realization felt overwhelming. Questions began to form rapidly in the mind. Why did anyone ask what really happened? Why was the lie trusted more than the person who had been part of the family for 15 years? Those questions did have answers in that moment, and the silence surrounding them made the betrayal feel even deeper. Outside, the storm continued to grow stronger, thunder echoing across the sky, while rain fell harder against the windows. Inside, the emotional storm carried the same intensity. The feeling of belonging that had always existed in that house began to disappear, replaced by a painful understanding that trust can vanish in an instant. At 15, betrayal from strangers might cause anger or sadness, but betrayal from family creates something far more complicated. It shakes the foundation of identity, turning what once felt certain into something fragile and uncertain, leaving a young mind struggling to understand how love and disbelief could exist in the same moment. The storm had been building for hours, slowly turning the sky from pale gray to a deep, restless darkness. By the time night fully arrived, the wind had grown fierce enough to bend the trees and rattle the windows of the house. Rain fell in heavy sheets, striking the roof and ground with a constant roar that drowned out almost every other sound. Lightning flashed across the sky in sudden bursts, lighting up the world for only a split second before everything returned to darkness again. It was the kind of storm that made people stay inside, locking doors and waiting for it to pass. Inside the house, the tension that had been growing all evening had finally reached its breaking point. Voices rose louder than the thunder outside, sharp with anger and frustration. Every word spoken carried weight, and every glance seemed colder than the last. The lie that had started everything still hung in the air, shaping every reaction and every decision that followed. In the middle of that chaos, it became painfully clear that the storm outside was no longer the most dangerous thing happening that night. The door opened, and the cold wind rushed inside immediately, bringing rain and the sharp scent of wet pavement with it. The sound of the storm became even louder, as if the outside world had suddenly stepped directly into the house. The air felt freezing against the skin, and the darkness beyond the doorway looked endless. Lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating the empty street, and the rain poured down without mercy. Being pushed toward that storm felt unreal at first. At 15, the idea of being forced out of the only home ever known seemed impossible to believe. Homes are supposed to protect people from storms, not send them directly into one. But the anger inside the house had already decided what would happen. The accusations had turned into punishment, and the punishment came without hesitation. Stepping outside meant facing the storm alone. The rain soaked through clothes within seconds, cold and relentless. Wind howled through the street, making it difficult to hear anything except the constant roar of the weather. Thunder cracked overhead so loudly that it felt like the sky itself was splitting apart. Standing there in the darkness, surrounded by rain and wind, The storm felt like more than just weather. It reflected the chaos that had exploded inside the house only moments before. The cold, the noise, the blinding flashes of lightning all mirrored the confusion and pain that had arrived just as suddenly, turning a familiar life into something unrecognizable in a single night. The rain fell harder with every passing minute, soaking through clothes until the cold began to settle deep into the skin. Wind rushed down the empty street in powerful bursts, pushing against the body and making it difficult to stand still. At 15, standing alone in the middle of that storm felt unreal. If the entire world had suddenly become too large and too hostile, the house that once meant safety was now behind, its door closed, its lights distant, and unreachable through the heavy curtain of rain. Every sound seemed louder in the darkness. Thunder cracked across the sky with a force that shook the ground, while lightning flashed in quick, blinding bursts that briefly illuminated the empty road. Each flash revealed the same lonely scene: wet pavement, swaying trees, and endless rain. In the seconds between lightning strikes, everything returned to darkness again, leaving only the steady roar of the storm. The feeling of being completely alone. Fear slowly crept in. Not as a sudden panic, but as a growing weight in the chest. It was the kind of fear that comes from realizing there is nowhere to go and no one nearby to help. At 15, the world outside the comfort of home can feel unfamiliar and overwhelming, especially in the middle of the night with a storm raging all around. The mind begins to race with questions that have no easy answers. Where to go? How long will this storm last? What happens next? The cold made everything harder to think about clearly. Rainwater ran down the face and into the eyes, mixing with tears that were impossible to hide in such weather. Shoes slipped slightly on the wet pavement, and the wind pulled at every step forward. Each movement felt uncertain, as if the storm itself was trying to push back against every attempt to keep going. Beyond the physical discomfort was the deeper feeling of isolation. The street seemed empty, every house dark behind closed curtains and locked doors. People inside those homes were warm and safe, completely unaware that someone stood outside in the storm with nowhere to turn. The world suddenly felt distant and indifferent, as though no one could see what was happening. The combination of fear, cold, and betrayal created a heavy silence inside the mind. Words spoken earlier in the house echoed again and again, repeating like distant thunder. The realization settled slowly but painfully. Being alone in that storm wasn't just about the weather. It was about understanding that at that moment there was no one standing beside them, no voice called them back inside. Only the endless rain and the overwhelming feeling of being completely abandoned. Standing alone in the storm, the rain falling endlessly, and the wind pushing from every direction, the mind began to drift into a place filled with questions that had never appeared before. At 15, life had always felt connected to family, as if identity itself was tied to the way parents looked at their child, and the way home felt safe no matter what happened outside. But now, with the door closed behind and the storm swallowing the street in darkness, a painful thought slowly formed. What if the way they saw that child had never truly been what it seemed? Every word spoken earlier in the house echoed again and again. The anger, the accusations, the disbelief, all replayed in the mind like a broken recording. Each repetition made the moment feel heavier, more confusing. The question that kept rising above the noise of the storm was simple but terrifying. If the people who had raised and protected for 15 years could believe something so quickly, then what did that say about how they truly felt all along? The rain soaked through everything, clinging to skin and clothes, but the cold that settled deeper came from inside. Self-doubt began creeping into thoughts that had once felt certain. Maybe there had been signs before that had been ignored. Maybe there were moments where trust had already started to fade without anyone noticing. The storm outside blurred the world, and the storm inside blurred memories, make everything feel uncertain. It became difficult not to question personal worth. If one lie could destroy 15 years of trust in a matter of minutes, it made the entire past feel fragile. Had those years really meant something, or had they only seemed important because no one had challenged them before? The mind searched through old memories, family dinners, laughter in the living room, quiet conversations, but now each memory felt different, as if doubt had quietly rewritten parts of the past. The street remained empty, rain bouncing off the pavement, while lightning briefly revealed the same lonely surroundings again and again. With every flash of light, there was a brief hope that someone might appear. or that a voice might call from the house behind. But the darkness always returned just as quickly, leaving the same silence and the same unanswered question. At 15, identity is still fragile, still being shaped by the people closest in life. When those people suddenly turn away, it can feel as though the foundation beneath that identity begins to crack. In that storm, surrounded by wind and rain, the painful thought kept growing stronger. If family could abandon trust so easily, then perhaps being valued had never been as certain as it once seemed. The storm seemed to grow stronger with every passing minute, as if the sky itself had decided to unleash all of its anger at once. Rain slammed against the pavement in heavy waves, bouncing back into the air and creating a constant mist that blurred everything in sight. The wind howled through the empty street, bending tree branches and sending loose leaves spinning across the ground. Thunder rolled above like a deep, endless roar, shaking the air before another streak of lightning tore through the darkness. Standing in the middle of that chaos, it became impossible to separate the storm outside from the storm building inside. Every flash of lightning felt like a sudden burst of emotion, sharp, bright, and impossible to ignore. The thunder that followed carried the same heavy weight as the words that had been spoken earlier in the house, echoing again and again in the mind. The weather seemed to mirror every feeling that was rising within. The cold rain running down the face mixed with tears, making it difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. The storm hid those emotions perfectly, disguising pain behind the endless downpour. Anyone passing by might only see someone caught in bad weather, never realizing that the real storm was happening within the heart and mind. Each gust of wind felt like another wave of confusion and betrayal. The force of it pushed against every step, just like the memories pushing through thoughts. The accusations, the disbelief, the sudden anger from the people who were supposed to care the most all returned with every crack of thunder. It was as if the storm had become a reflection of everything that had gone wrong in a single night. Lightning illuminated the street in quick bursts, revealing a world that looked cold and unfamiliar. Houses stood silently with their windows glowing faintly behind closed curtains, warm and protected from the storm outside. Those small lights made the darkness around them feel even deeper, reminding anyone standing outside how far away safety truly was. The sky seemed restless, unable to settle, constantly shifting between flashes of light and long stretches of darkness. That restless movement felt similar to the emotions racing through the mind: anger, confusion, sadness, disbelief, each one rising and falling without warning. Nothing felt stable anymore, not the weather and not the feelings that filled the silence between thunderclaps. In that moment, the storm no longer felt like ordinary weather. It felt like a powerful reflection of the chaos that had taken over life in just a few hours. The sky raged above, the wind pushed without mercy, and the rain refused to stop, all echoing the same message. Sometimes the world outside perfectly mirrors the turmoil growing inside a broken heart. The storm had now reached its most violent point. Rain falling so heavily that the street looked like a river under the dim glow of distant streetlights. Water rushed along the pavement, swirling around drains while wind tore through the trees with a wild, restless force. Lightning cracked across the sky again and again, lighting the world in sudden flashes that made everything appear sharp and cold for only a moment before darkness swallowed it once more. Standing alone in the middle of that storm, the noise of the rain and thunder created a strange isolation, as if the entire world had become distant and unreachable. By this point, exhaustion had begun to replace the earlier shock and confusion. The cold had seeped through every layer of clothing, making each breath feel heavier than the last. Arms wrapped tightly around the body offered little protection against the wind that pushed relentlessly from every direction. Every step felt slower, every thought harder to hold on to clearly. The energy that had once fueled the desire to explain the truth earlier in the house was gone, replaced by a quiet emptiness. In moments like this, the mind begins to wander into darker places. The question of what to do next became impossible to answer. The street stretched ahead without direction, every house closed and silent, every window hiding warmth that seemed unreachable. There was nowhere obvious to go, no clear path forward, and no sign that the storm would end anytime soon. The feeling of hopelessness arrived slowly but firmly, like the steady rain that refused to stop. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was quiet and heavy, settling deep inside with the realization that everything familiar had disappeared in a single night. The house behind was no longer a place to return to, and the future ahead looked uncertain and frightening. Lightning flashed again, revealing the empty road for a brief moment. The reflection of water on the pavement made the street look endless, stretching far beyond what the eyes could see in the darkness. Thunder followed almost instantly, shaking the air and reminding anyone standing beneath the sky just how small they truly were. For a moment, it felt easier to simply stop moving. The idea of standing still and letting the storm continue around seemed less exhausting than trying to fight through it alone. The cold wind brushed against the skin, rain falling without pause, and the darkness surrounding everything created a silence within the mind that felt dangerously close to giving up. In that quiet, overwhelming moment, the weight of the night pressed down completely, leaving only the fragile hope that somehow, somewhere, something might change before the storm consumed everything. The storm continued to rage without mercy, the rain pounding against the pavement, while wind rushed through the street in powerful bursts. Thunder rolled across the sky again, loud enough to shake the silence that had settled inside the mind. Standing there, soaked and exhausted, the night felt endless. Every direction looked the same, dark, empty, and uncertain. It seemed as if the world had completely forgotten that someone was standing there, alone in the middle of the storm. Then, in the distance, something shifted. At first, it was just a faint sound carried by the wind, barely noticeable beneath the roar of the rain. It was different from the thunder and different from the rustling trees. Slowly, the sound became clearer, like footsteps moving through shallow water on the pavement. The mind almost ignored it at first, assuming it was just another trick of the storm, another noise created by the wind or rain hitting nearby objects. But the sound did disappear. It grew closer. Lightning flashed across the sky, briefly illuminating the street, and for a split second a figure appeared in the distance. The light vanished almost instantly, returning everything to darkness again, leaving only the memory of what might have been seen. For a moment it was impossible to tell whether it had been real or just imagination playing tricks in the storm. The footsteps continued, steady and unhurried. As the figure approached, the rain revealed the outline of someone moving carefully through the downpour. It wasn't someone running to escape the storm like most people would. The movement was calm and deliberate, as if the storm itself did matter. Another flash of lightning lit the street, and this time the figure was closer, clearer against the rain. At 15, standing alone and vulnerable, the sudden appearance of a stranger created a mix of emotions that were difficult to understand. Part of the mind felt relief that another human being was nearby. Another part felt uncertain, unsure whether this new presence would bring help or more trouble. The wind continued to howl, pulling at loose clothing, while rain streamed down the street like a river. The stranger stopped only a few steps away, the storm swirling around both of them in the darkness. For a brief moment, there was silence between thunderclaps, and in that quiet space it became clear that someone had noticed the lonely figure standing in the storm. In a night filled with anger, betrayal, and fear, sudden presence of someone who had simply chosen to walk closer instead of passing by felt unexpected, almost unreal, like the first small crack of light breaking through a sky that had been dark for far too long. The stranger stood there for a moment as the rain poured down around them, the storm still roaring through the empty street. Lightning flashed again, briefly lighting both figures before darkness returned. Up close, the presence of another person made the silence feel different. The night no longer felt completely empty, yet uncertainty still lingered in the air. At 15, after everything that had just happened, trusting anyone felt difficult. The mind was still filled with the echoes of anger and betrayal from the house only minutes before. The stranger noticed the soaked clothes, the trembling from the cold, and the exhausted expression that the storm could not hide. Instead of asking harsh questions or showing suspicion, the stranger's voice came calmly, steady even against the noise of the wind. There was no judgment in that voice, no anger, only quiet concern that seemed genuine. In a night where every word earlier had carried accusation, hearing a voice that sounded patient felt almost unfamiliar. The rain continued to fall heavily, running down the street and splashing against their shoes. The stranger stepped slightly closer, just enough to be heard over the wind. There was a brief moment of hesitation, as if carefully deciding what to say. Then a simple question came, asking if everything was all right. The question itself seemed almost strange, because it was the first time that night someone had asked about well-being instead of placing blame. At first, answering felt impossible. The words were trapped somewhere behind exhaustion and disbelief. The storm had drained both physical strength and emotional energy, leaving only silence. The stranger seemed to understand that silence without pushing for an explanation. Instead of demanding answers, the stranger removed a coat and gently held it out. The act was small, almost ordinary, but in that moment, it carried enormous weight. The coat was warm and dry compared to the cold rain-soaked clothes. Accepting it felt strange, like accepting kindness after hours of feeling unwanted. The stranger did to rush the moment or make it feel uncomfortable. There was simply patience in the gesture, as if helping someone in the storm was the most natural thing in the world. The wind continued to blow through the street, and thunder rumbled far above, but the atmosphere around that small moment of kindness felt different from the chaos of the storm. A stranger, someone with no obligation, had chosen compassion where others had chosen anger. In the middle of a night filled with rejection, that simple act of offering warmth felt like the first reminder that not everyone in the world had turned away. The rain continued to fall heavily, soaking the street and turning the ground into a shimmering reflection of the faint streetlights above. The wind still pushed through the trees with force, carrying the sound of distant thunder that echoed through the night. Standing there with the stranger, the cold had already settled deep into the body, making every movement slower and every breath feel heavier. The coat that had been offered brought a small amount of warmth, but the storm still surrounded everything. The stranger looked around the empty street for a moment, as if quietly considering the situation. The houses nearby were dark and silent, their windows glowing faintly behind closed curtains. The storm made the entire neighborhood feel distant and unreachable. After a brief pause, the stranger spoke again, the voice calm and steady despite the wind. Instead of asking more questions about what had happened, the stranger simply said there was a warm place nearby where the storm could be waited out. At 15, the idea of stepping into a stranger's space might normally feel frightening, but the night had already pushed past the limits of what felt normal. Being alone in the storm had made the world feel far more dangerous than the quiet offer of shelter. The rain continued to pour down relentlessly, making the choice seem clearer with every passing second. The stranger began walking slowly down the street, not rushing and not looking back to force a decision. It was more like an invitation than an order, a quiet understanding that the choice had to be made freely. The wind carried the sound of footsteps splashing lightly through shallow water on the pavement. After a moment of hesitation, those footsteps were followed. The walk wasn't long, but the storm made it feel longer than it really was. Rain bounced off the ground while lightning occasionally illuminated the path ahead. Finally, the stranger stopped in front of a modest house with a warm light glowing through one of the windows. Compared to the cold darkness outside, that small light looked almost unreal. The door opened, and warm air immediately drifted outward, carrying the comforting smell of a dry, quiet home. The difference between outside and inside was overwhelming. The sound of the storm softened the moment the door closed behind them, turning the roaring wind and pounding rain into distant background noise. For the first time that night, there was warmth, light, and the simple feeling of safety. The stranger had not only offered kindness but also a place where the chaos of the storm could no longer reach, replacing cold uncertainty with the quiet comfort of shelter. Inside the house, the atmosphere felt completely different from the chaos outside. The storm could still be heard faintly through the walls, the distant rumble of thunder and the steady rhythm of rain against the roof, but those sounds no longer felt threatening. The warmth inside slowly pushed away the cold that had settled into the body. Soft light filled the room, revealing simple furniture and a quiet space that felt calm and steady compared to the darkness of the street just moments before. The stranger moved naturally through the house, bringing a towel and placing it gently nearby, without making the moment feel uncomfortable or overwhelming. There was no rush to ask questions, no pressure to explain anything immediately. Instead, there was patience, as if the stranger understood that some nights carry more weight than words can easily describe. That quiet patience made the room feel even safer. At 15, after hours of fear, anger, and confusion, simply sitting down in a warm place felt strange at first. The mind was still racing, replaying everything that had happened earlier in the evening. But the steady calm of the house slowly began to quiet those thoughts. The storm outside continued, yet inside the space remained peaceful, untouched by the chaos beyond the walls. The stranger eventually returned with a warm drink, placing it on the table without making a big gesture out of it. The warmth from the cup spread through cold hands, bringing a small but noticeable sense of comfort. It was a simple act, but after the events of that night, even simple kindness carried enormous meaning. Conversation began slowly, not about accusations or blame but about small, ordinary things that allowed the tension to ease. The stranger listened more than spoke, showing a kind of understanding that did to require many words. For the first time since the evening had turned dark, there was a feeling that someone actually cared, enough to listen rather than judge. That moment became more important than it first appeared. What started as a random meeting in the middle of a storm slowly turned into something deeper, a connection formed through compassion and understanding rather than obligation. The stranger had no reason to help, no family duty or responsibility, yet had chosen to step into someone else's difficult night and offer support. In the quiet warmth of that house, something began to change. The night that had started with betrayal and loneliness was now creating a new path forward. That unexpected act of kindness did just provide shelter from the storm. It created a turning point, the beginning of a connection that would quietly reshape everything that came afterward. The storm eventually passed, but the events of that night did not fade as quickly. Days turned into weeks, and weeks slowly became months. Life began to move forward in ways that were completely different from what had once been familiar. The warmth and safety that had been offered on that stormy night slowly grew into something more stable, something that resembled the kind of support that had suddenly disappeared before. The stranger who had stepped into the darkness that night continued to show patience and quiet understanding, allowing space to heal without forcing the past to be forgotten. At 15, everything had felt like it ended in a single moment, but time has a strange way of reshaping painful experiences. The memory of the storm remained vivid, yet the days that followed began building something new. There were routines again, simple daily moments that slowly replaced the chaos of that night. School continued, conversations happened, and life started to regain a sense of direction. Even though the pain had not vanished, it no longer felt as overwhelming as it had in those first hours of loneliness. Meanwhile, somewhere else, the lie that had started everything continued to exist quietly beneath the surface. Lies often feel powerful in the moment they are spoken, but they require constant effort to survive. Small details have a way of slipping out over time, especially when the truth does not match the story that was originally told. Conversations between people began to reveal tiny inconsistencies. Certain explanations no longer aligned perfectly with what had been claimed before. At first, those inconsistencies seemed small and easy to ignore, but time continued moving forward, and the story that once sounded convincing slowly began to feel less stable. Questions that had never been asked before started appearing in quiet moments of reflection. Memories were revisited, and certain parts of the story no longer made complete sense. The truth did to appear all at once like lightning during the storm. Instead, it revealed itself slowly, piece by piece, like sunlight gradually breaking through clouds after a long night of rain. The more time passed, the harder it became to ignore the growing doubts surrounding the accusation that had once seemed so certain. What had once been believed without hesitation was now beginning to crack under the weight of reality. The lie that had destroyed trust in a single night was no longer as strong as it had seemed. Time was quietly doing what no argument had been able to do before, exposing the fragile foundation that the entire accusation had been built upon. Time has a way of revealing what people try to hide. In the beginning, the lie had sounded convincing because it was spoken with urgency and emotion. Everyone who heard it had accepted it quickly, reacting to the fear and anger in the moment instead of looking closely at the details. But as weeks turned into months, the story that once seemed clear began to feel less certain. Small inconsistencies slowly appeared, the kind that are easy to overlook at first but impossible to ignore once they start repeating. Conversation about that night still surfaced from time to time, especially when people tried to make sense of everything that had happened. During those conversations, the same details were told again and again, but each time the story was repeated, something seemed slightly different. Certain moments did match earlier explanations, and small parts of the timeline began to shift in ways that did quite make sense. At first, those differences were brushed aside as simple confusion. Memories can be imperfect, especially when emotions run high. But over time the pattern became clearer. The more the story was revisited, the more obvious it became that pieces of it were changing. What had once been described with certainty now came with hesitation. One day, a detail slipped out that hadn't been mentioned before. It seemed minor at first, but it contradicted something that had been claimed earlier. That contradiction raised the first real doubt. If one part of the story was incorrect, then the rest of it needed to be questioned as well. Once doubt enters a story built on deception, it spreads quickly. People began asking quiet questions, replaying memories of that night, and comparing them with what had been said afterward. The more those memories were examined, the more the truth began to surface. Certain events simply could have happened the way they were originally described. The realization didn't come with dramatic shouting or sudden confrontation. Instead, it arrived slowly, settling into the minds of those who began to understand what had really taken place. The accusation that had once seemed undeniable now looked fragile, as if it had been held together only by emotion and assumption. Eventually, the truth became impossible to ignore. The story that had been told that night was not just exaggerated or misunderstood, it had been completely false. The deception that had caused so much damage was finally revealed, exposing the painful reality that everything had started with a lie that should never have been believed in the first place. The moment the truth began to settle in, the atmosphere changed in a way that words could barely capture. For a long time, the accusation had been treated as unquestionable, some accepted so quickly that no one had stopped to examine it carefully. Now, with the inconsistencies exposed and the story falling apart piece by piece, the weight of that realization started pressing heavily on the people who had believed it without hesitation. At first, the reaction was quiet disbelief. It was difficult to accept that something so serious had been built on a lie. Memories of that stormy night slowly resurfaced. But this time they were viewed from a completely different perspective. The raised voices, the anger, the decision made in the heat of the moment, all of it now looked different under the light of the truth. The realization did arrive all at once, like a sudden burst of lightning. Instead, it crept in gradually, settling deeper with every passing thought. Certain words that had been spoken that night echoed again in memory, but now they carried a different meaning. The anger that once felt justified began to feel misplaced, and the confidence in the accusations slowly turned into uncertainty. The heaviest part of that realization was understanding what had happened afterward. The storm outside had been fierce, but the decision made during that storm had been far more powerful. A 15-year-old had been pushed out into the darkness based on something that wasn't even real. That fact alone was difficult to face, and it lingered heavily in every quiet moment of reflection. Guilt began to grow where certainty once existed. The memory of the closed door, the sound of the wind rushing inside, the image of someone standing alone in the rain returned again and again. What had once felt like discipline or protection now appeared as something far more serious. The thought that the wrong person had been blamed made every memory of that night harder to carry. Silence often filled the house where the accusation had first been spoken. The same rooms that had once echoed with anger now felt heavy with regret. It became impossible to ignore the fact that a mistake had been made, and not a small one. The truth had exposed something painful, that trust had been given to the wrong story, and the consequences of that decision had changed everything. In that quiet realization, the certainty that once fueled the anger was gone. What remained instead was the heavy understanding that a terrible mistake had been made, and the damage caused by that moment could never truly be undone. Once the truth could no longer be ignored, the silence inside the house became unbearable. Every room seemed to hold memories of that night, and those memories now carried a weight that had never been felt before. The anger that had once filled the air had disappeared, replaced by a deep and uncomfortable realization. What had happened during the storm was no longer just an argument or a misunderstanding. It was a moment that had changed a life. Thoughts kept returning to the image of someone standing alone outside in the rain, the door closing behind them while thunder echoed across the sky. At the time, it had felt like the right decision, a reaction fueled by belief in the accusation that had been spoken so confidently. But now, knowing the accusation had been false, that same memory looked completely different. What had once felt justified now appeared harsh and unforgivable. The house itself felt strangely empty after the realization. The absence that had followed that night was suddenly impossible to ignore. There was no familiar voice moving through the hallway, no presence in the living room, no quiet sound of footsteps passing from one room to another. That absence began to feel louder than the storm had ever been. It became clear that the mistake could simply be acknowledged and forgotten. Something had to be done. The thought of leaving things the way they were felt impossible. The only thing that seemed to matter now was finding the one who had been pushed away and somehow making things right. even if it was already far too late for apologies to erase what had happened. The search did to begin with certainty about where to look. There were no clear answers about where someone might go after being forced out into a storm at 15. But the determination to find them grew stronger with every passing day. Conversations started happening with people who might know something, neighbors, acquaintances, anyone who might have seen or heard anything. After that night, every small clue became important, even the smallest piece of information that could point in the right direction. The search stretched beyond the familiar neighborhood, moving further and further as questions continued to be asked. Each step carried a mixture of hope and fear. Hope that they might be found, and fear about what the truth of that meeting might look like. The storm from that night had long passed, but its consequences were still unfolding. Somewhere out in the world was the person who had been left behind in the rain, and the only thought that remained now was the desperate need to find them and face what had been done. Time passed, and the search slowly stretched into something longer and more uncertain than anyone had expected. At first there had been urgency, a desperate need to fix what had been broken the moment the truth came out. But as days turned into months and months quietly blended into years, the search became more complicated. The world is large, and once someone disappears into it, finding them again is never simple. Yet the thought of that stormy night never fully faded. It stayed in the background of every day, returning in quiet moments and unexpected memories. The sound of thunder during another storm, the sight of rain hitting the pavement, or even the cold wind pushing through the streets could suddenly bring everything rushing back. Each reminder carried the same question. Where had that 15-year-old gone after walking away into the darkness? Eventually, a small piece of information appeared, almost by accident. It was the kind of detail that might normally seem unimportant, something overheard in conversation or mentioned casually by someone who didn't realize how much it mattered. But this small clue suggested that the one who had been pushed away years ago had not disappeared completely. Life had continued, and somehow that life had led to a place not as far away as everyone had once imagined. The possibility of finally seeing them again created a strange mixture of anticipation and fear. There had been so many years to think about what might be said in that moment, yet none of those imagined conversations felt real anymore. The truth was that no one could know how such a meeting would unfold after so much time had passed. When the moment finally came, it arrived quietly rather than dramatically. There was no storm raging outside this time. No thunder rolling across the sky. The air felt calm, almost too calm compared to the night when everything had fallen apart. Across the distance stood the person who had once been forced into the storm, no longer a frightened teenager, but someone who had clearly grown stronger with time. For a brief moment, everything seemed to slow down. Years of regret, unanswered questions, and painful memories filled the space between them. The past and the present collided in that silent moment of recognition, creating a tension that felt almost impossible to describe. The long search had finally led to this point. After all the time that had passed since the stormy night, the paths that had separated so suddenly had crossed again, bringing everyone face to face with the consequences of a decision made long ago. When the moment of reunion finally arrived, the air carried a strange stillness that felt heavier than any storm. Years had passed since that night when the rain poured endlessly and a frightened 15-year-old had been left alone in the darkness. Time had changed many things, but the memory of that moment remained sharp for everyone involved. Standing there now, seeing each other again after so long, felt almost unreal, as if the past and present had suddenly collided in one quiet instant. The person who had once been pushed out into the storm no longer looked like the same teenager from that night. Time had shaped them into someone stronger, someone who carried a calm confidence that had not existed before. The years away had clearly been filled with experiences that had built resilience and independence. The frightened figure who had stood in the rain had been replaced by someone who seemed steady and self-assured. But what truly captured attention in that moment was not just the transformation. It was the presence of someone standing beside them. That figure, calm and protective, carried a quiet authority that made the scene feel even more powerful. For a brief second, confusion crossed the faces of those who had been searching for so long. The question formed instantly: who was this person who had become part of the life that continued after that stormy night? Recognition began slowly, like a memory struggling to surface after years of being buried. Something about the face seemed familiar, though it was difficult to place at first. Then the realization appeared: sudden and overwhelming. The stranger who had once stepped out of the storm and offered help had not simply disappeared afterward. That act of kindness had grown into something far greater than anyone had imagined. The truth became clear in that silent moment. The person who had been abandoned during the storm had not been left alone after all. Someone had seen the situation, stepped forward, and chosen compassion when others had chosen anger. That single decision had changed the course of an entire life. What made the moment even more powerful was the contrast between past and present. Years earlier, the teenager had stood alone in the rain with nowhere to go. Now they stood beside someone who had offered protection and guidance when it mattered most. The one who had once been a stranger had become a source of stability and support. The realization settled heavily into the air. The person who had saved that frightened teenager during the storm was standing there now, quietly proving that sometimes the greatest turning points in life come from the unexpected kindness of someone who simply chose to help when no one else would. The person standing there was no longer the frightened teenager who had once been pushed into the storm, with nothing but confusion and pain. Time had shaped that life in ways no one could have predicted during that terrible night. The years that followed had been difficult at first, filled with adjustment, and the slow process of rebuilding confidence after such a deep betrayal. But with the guidance and support of the one who had stepped forward that night, those early struggles slowly turned into strength. Education became a focus, something that offered direction and purpose. The quiet encouragement that came from the person who had offered shelter during the storm made a powerful difference. Instead of being defined by the events of that night, the determination grew to prove that life could move forward in a better way. Day by day, effort turned into progress, and progress gradually turned into achievement. The transformation was not sudden or easy. There were many moments when memories of the past returned, moments when the pain of that stormy night felt as real as it had years before. But each challenge was met with persistence. The person who had once been abandoned learned to stand independently, building skills, knowledge, and confidence that slowly reshaped the future. Now, standing in that moment of reunion, the difference was impossible to ignore. The posture was confident, the expression calm, and the presence carried a quiet strength that could not be overlooked. This was someone who had clearly built a life rather than simply surviving the past. Clothing, manner, and the way of speaking all reflected a life that had moved forward successfully. There was evidence of stability, of hard work that had paid off. The teenager who had once walked alone through rain and darkness had grown into someone capable, someone respected, someone who no longer depended on the approval of those who had once turned away. That transformation carried a powerful message without needing to be spoken out loud. The storm that had once seemed like the end of everything had instead become the beginning of a different path. What had started with rejection had eventually led to resilience and success. The contrast between past and present stood clearly in that moment. Years earlier, a young life had been cast out into the storm with uncertainty and fear. Now, that same life stood strong and composed, showing that even the most painful moments can become turning points when someone finds the strength and the support to rise beyond them. Standing there after so many years, there was no need for raised voices, accusations, or dramatic words. The difference between the past and the present spoke louder than any argument ever could. The teenager who had once stood alone in a violent storm had grown into someone who carried quiet confidence and undeniable strength. That transformation itself became the most powerful response to everything that had happened. Revenge, in the traditional sense, often involves anger or the desire to cause pain in return. But the kind of revenge that unfolded here was far different. It was silent, patient, and built slowly through time. Instead of trying to prove innocence through arguments or confrontation, the focus had shifted toward building a life that could not be easily dismissed or ignored. The years that followed the storm had been filled with effort and determination, education, discipline, and the support of the person who had offered help. That night had created opportunities that might never have existed otherwise. Every step forward had been earned through persistence, turning what could have been a life defined by rejection into a life defined by achievement. Now, standing in front of those who had once believed the lie without question, there was no need to remind them of the past. The evidence of survival and success was visible in every detail. The calm way of speaking, the confidence in posture, and the clear sense of independence all revealed the same truth. The storm that was meant to break a young life had instead strengthened it. That realization carried a powerful emotional weight. Years earlier, the teenager had been powerless, forced to leave home with no control over the situation. Now the balance had shifted completely. The power in the moment no longer belonged to those who had once made the decision. During that stormy night, the silence between them said everything. No harsh words were needed, because the life that had been built already told the entire story. The person who had once been rejected had not only survived but had thrived in ways no one had expected. This kind of revenge didn't rely on anger or bitterness. It came through growth, resilience, and success. It showed that sometimes the strongest response to betrayal is not destruction but transformation, becoming so strong and accomplished that the people who once doubted you can only stand there in quiet realization of what they had almost destroyed. In that quiet moment of reunion, the air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. Words were difficult to find, not because there was nothing to say but because too much had happened over the years to fit into a simple conversation. The person who had once been forced out into the storm now stood calmly, composed and steady, while the past hung silently between them. The one who had once made the decision during that stormy night stood facing the result of that choice. For years, the memory of that night had remained buried under regret and unanswered questions. But seeing the person who had been left in the rain brought those memories rushing back with painful clarity. The image of the door closing, the sound of the wind pushing through the house, and the sight of a teenager stepping out into the darkness all returned at once. The realization of what had nearly been lost settled heavily in the room. The transformation standing in front of them was undeniable. The frightened teenager from that night was gone, replaced by someone confident and strong. But instead of pride, that sight brought a deep wave of guilt. Hands that had once acted with certainty now trembled slightly. It was not the cold of the storm this time, but the weight of regret that caused the subtle shaking. The fingers tightened and relaxed again, as if trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away years before. The small movement revealed something that words could not easily express. That trembling carried the emotion of many unspoken thoughts. It reflected the realization that the anger of that night had led to a decision that could never truly be taken back. Even though the years had passed and life had moved forward, the memory of that choice remained frozen in time. Looking at the person standing there now made the truth even harder to face. The strength and independence that had grown over the years showed clearly that life had continued without the support that should have been given. Someone else had stepped in during the moment when help had been most needed. The shaking hands became a quiet symbol of everything that had changed. They showed the difference between the certainty of the past and the regret of the present. The one who had once believed the lie, without question, was now standing face to face with the consequences of that belief, realizing that the storm had not only happened outside that night, it had forever altered the path of a life. For years, the balance of power in that family had been clear and unquestioned. At 15, the teenager had stood in a position where decisions were made by others, where explanation could be ignored, and where a single accusation had been enough to determine what would happen next. On that stormy night, there had been no control over the situation, no authority to challenge the decision that forced a young life out into the darkness. The power had belonged entirely to the people inside the house who chose to believe the lie. But time has a way of quietly shifting that balance. The years that followed created distance not only in location but in strength, independence, and perspective. The frightened teenager who once depended on the approval and protection of family had grown into someone who no longer relied on those things to define their life. Experience, effort, and determination had slowly replaced the vulnerability of youth with a steady confidence that could not easily be shaken. Standing there during the reunion, the difference between the past and the present became clear. The people who had once held complete authority over the situation now faced someone who was no longer powerless. The person in front of them had built a life independently, shaped by choices made without their guidance or support. That independence carried a quiet authority of its own. The shift in power did not appear through anger or confrontation. There were no loud accusations or attempts to humiliate anyone for the mistakes of the past. Instead, the change revealed itself through calm control, the ability to stand confidently, to speak without fear, and to remain composed. In such an emotional moment showed just how much had changed over the years. In the past, the teenager had been the one forced to listen, to accept decisions made by others without having a voice in them. Now the situation had reversed in a subtle but powerful way. The ones who had once judged and punished were now the ones waiting, uncertain of what would be said or done next. That silent shift carried enormous emotional weight. The power no longer came from authority or control over someone else's life. It came from resilience, from the ability to survive betrayal and still stand strong afterward. The storm that had once left a young life feeling helpless had ultimately created someone far stronger than anyone had expected. In that moment of reunion, it became clear that the person who had once been cast out into the rain now held the true power. In the situation, the power to decide what would come next. Standing in that moment, after so many years, the past felt close enough to touch. The memory of the storm, the accusations, and the cold darkness outside the house still lived clearly in the mind. Time had allowed life to grow stronger and more stable, but it had not erased the night when everything changed. Seeing the faces that once turned away brought those memories forward again, forcing a quiet but powerful question to rise inside. What should be done now? Part of the heart still carried the pain of that night. At 15, being forced into a violent storm because of a lie had left a wound that time alone could not completely remove. The memory of standing alone in the rain, with thunder echoing overhead and the door closed behind, had shaped the way trust and belonging were understood afterward. Those moments had built strength, but they had also left scars. At the same time, years of growth had created a different perspective. Life had moved forward, and the support received from the person who stepped forward that night had helped rebuild confidence and purpose. Education, experience, and independence had opened opportunities that once seemed impossible during those dark hours of abandonment. The past had become part of the journey, but it was no longer the only thing defining the future. This created a deep internal conflict. Forgiveness is often spoken about as if it is simple, but standing in front of the people who once believed a lie without question made the idea far more complicated. Letting go of anger could bring peace, yet forgetting the past felt impossible. The memory of the storm was not something that could be erased or treated lightly. There was also the understanding that holding on to bitterness forever could trap the past in the present. Carrying that weight endlessly might allow the mistake of others to continue shaping the future long after it happened. The challenge was finding a balance between remembering the truth and choosing not to let that truth destroy the life that had been built afterward. In that quiet moment, the decision was not about proving a point or delivering punishment. It was about deciding what kind of person to be after everything that had happened. The storm had once taken away safety and trust, but it had also created resilience and clarity. The struggle between forgiveness and justice remained heavy in the heart, leaving the final choice suspended in silence as the past and present waited for the next step forward. As the silence settled over that moment of reunion, the entire journey from that stormy night to the present seemed to unfold in memory all at once. What had begun as a simple lie had grown into something powerful enough to fracture trust, separate a family, and push a young life into the darkness of uncertainty. The consequences of that single lie had stretched far beyond the moment it was spoken, shaping years of pain, growth, and transformation. Looking back at everything that had happened, one truth became impossible to ignore. Trust is fragile, and once it is broken, the damage can trail much further than anyone expects. On that night long ago, belief in the accusation came quickly, without patience or careful thought. No one paused long enough to ask deeper questions or search for the full truth. In the heat of anger and fear, a decision was made that changed the direction of a life forever. The years that followed revealed how dangerous it can be when judgment replaces understanding. The storm outside that night eventually passed, but the emotional storm created by that decision lasted far longer. The teenager who had been pushed out into the rain had to rebuild life step by step, finding strength through hardship and discovering support in the most unexpected place. At the same time, the truth about the lie slowly surfaced, proving that assumptions made in moments of anger are often the most destructive. What had once seemed certain eventually collapsed under the weight of reality. The story that had been trusted so quickly turned out to be nothing more than deception, leaving behind regret that could never fully erase the consequences of that mistake. Yet the story was not only about betrayal, it was also about resilience and the ability of the human spirit to rise above even the harshest circumstances. The life that had once seemed shattered by rejection had grown into something strong and independent. The storm that was meant to destroy confidence had instead built determination. In the end, the lesson that remained was clear and powerful. Truth deserves patience. Trust should never be thrown away without understanding both sides of a story. One lie spoken in anger can destroy relationships that took years to build, while one act of compassion can completely change the path of someone's life. That stormy night had revealed both the worst and the best of human choices. It showed how quickly trust can be lost, but also how strength, kindness, and truth can eventually lead a broken path towards something far greater than anyone once imagined. The storm that began this story was never only about rain, thunder, or darkness in the sky. It was about the moment when trust collapsed and a young life was pushed into the unknown because a lie was believed without question. That single decision changed everything. A home that once felt safe became a place of betrayal, and a 15-year-old who should have been protected was forced to face the world alone in the middle of the storm. But life has a powerful way of rewriting even the darkest chapters. What was meant to break a spirit instead built resilience. What was meant to leave someone lost instead led to a path of strength, growth, and independence. The storm that night could have ended everything, yet it quietly became the beginning of a completely different journey. Along that journey came an unexpected act of kindness from someone who had no obligation to help yet chose compassion over indifference. That single moment proved something powerful about the world. Sometimes the people who save us are not the ones we expect. Sometimes strangers become the ones who restore the faith that others have broken. Years later, when the truth finally surfaced and the past returned face to face with the present, the greatest response was not anger or revenge. It was strength. The kind of strength that comes from surviving betrayal and building a life that cannot be destroyed by someone else's mistake. True victory is not in making others suffer. True victory is standing tall after everything that tried to push you down. This story reminds us that lies may travel fast, but truth eventually finds its way into the light. It reminds us that judgment made in anger can destroy what love once built. And most importantly, it shows that no storm, no matter how violent, can stop a determined heart from rising again. To everyone listening to this story, remember that your hardest moments do not define the end of your journey. Sometimes they are only the beginning of a path you were meant to discover. No matter how dark the night may seem, the strength inside you can carry you toward a brighter morning. Thank you for listening and sharing this powerful story. I truly appreciate your time and attention. I wish you strength, success, and good luck on your own journey ahead. May every challenge you face turn into an opportunity to grow, and may every storm in your life eventually lead you to a brighter sky.